So right now, Mark Carney is thousands of miles away building a safety net for Canada because he knows the U.S. order hasn't just shifted, it's ruptured.
But while Carney is in Asia securing our future, Pierre Poilievre is in a Toronto ballroom telling Canadians to calm down.
In the middle of an annexation threat and a trade war, Poilievre's sovereignty plan is to hug the elephant and punch down at refugees.
Today, we're exposing the two versions of Canada's future. One that builds a middle power shield and one that begs for Trump's permission.
Is Poilievre's Sovereignty Act a masterstroke or a total surrender? Let's get into it.
So yesterday, Pierre Poilievre is in a Toronto ballroom quoting Marcus Aurelius to the Economic Club. He's telling Canadians to calm their little emotions about the United States and focus on what we can control. Because nothing says I get the mood of the country like lecturing a furious electorate about their feelings in front of Bay Street.
The basic setup is this. Carney's out trying to build what he called in Davos a new middle power alliance, because he says the old U.S.-led order is over. A rupture, not a transition.
Meanwhile, Poilievre's big foreign policy moment is a retro NAFTA speech with a side of pipeline fan fiction and a warning that we must not offend the elephant next door. Plus, he delivered it in the same week a poll showed 3/4 of Canadians now have an unfavorable view of the U.S.
He does the whole greatest hits routine, right? Confederation, railways, the CN Tower, Sir John A. as the original productivity influencer. He even quotes Pierre Elliott Trudeau's sleeping next to an elephant line, as if we hadn't all just watched that elephant stand up, stomp around, and threaten to stick a flag in our own lawn.
And look, on paper some of this sounds reasonable. Of course we can't control what Trump does. Of course we need to be more self-reliant, build housing, speed up permits, fix defense. Nobody's arguing with the concept of a grown-up policy.
The problem is where his gaze is pointed. Because right now, Canadians are worried about an unhinged White House and a neighbor that we no longer trust. Poilievre hears that and decides the real danger is Mark Carney talking about middle powers at Davos and signing a limited EV and canola deal with China.
So let's talk about what Carney's actually doing while Poilievre is warning about a new world order with Beijing. First, Carney went to Beijing and cut tariffs on Canadian canola, seafood, and peas, from punishing levels down to something our farmers can actually live with.
At Davos, he told the room, including a very irritated Donald Trump, that the old U.S.-backed order is over and that the economic integration is being used as a weapon. And also that middle powers like Canada either band together or end up on the menu. He gets a standing ovation because he's saying what other world leaders are actually thinking. The U.S. is now a risk to manage, not a parent to impress.
He's building safety nets with Asia and other middle power democracies, so if Trump wakes up in a bad mood and slaps 100% tariffs on us again, well, the whole Canadian economy doesn't just go right through the windshield.
Now, contrast that with Poilievre's big vision, right? His starting premise isn't the U.S. is now a structural risk. His starting premise is Canada's prosperity and security are inseparable from the stable relationship with the United States. Full stop. And then he warns, do not declare a permanent rupture. Do not build a new world order with Beijing.
As if that's what Carney was proposing. Carney said the old U.S.-led order is a rupture, not that Canada should rupture with the U.S. Poilievre is taking a hard truth about a broken system and spinning it into Mark Carney wants to break up with America, which is not what he said.
And here's the thing. We shouldn't be naive about any major power. The US, China, Europe, India, every one of them is out for themselves, and plenty of them don't share Canadian values. That's literally what trade is. You go in knowing everyone is looking out for number one, and you negotiate hard to turn that into a win-win. Poilievre's framing turns China into the only villain in the story and treats the US instability like bad weather we just have to live with. That's not foreign policy, people. That's wishful thinking.
Now, let's go through some of the specifics Poilievre pitches here, because on their own, some of them sound bold. In context, well, they're less impressive.
First, let's talk about the Unbreakable leverage plan. He wants a giant strategic reserve of energy and critical minerals that we can dangle in front of the Americans. They get access only if they keep our trade tariff-free.
Well, in theory, sure, having a stockpile of the stuff NATO economies need is smart. In practice, well, Carney has already lined up G7 investments into Canada, such as critical minerals, and inked deals with partners like Australia to build that supply chain anyway, without making it all about pleasing Washington.
And then there's his big idea to tie every dollar of defense procurement from the U.S. to tariff-free access for Canada. Sounds tough, right up until you remember who has more leverage in that relationship and how often Washington has happily thrown allies under the bus on trade while still cashing their checks for weapons.
He's also still chasing Keystone XL like it's 2012. We help keep Chinese cars out, American lets Canadian cars in, and gives our oil another pipe south. Well, Trump has made it very clear that he sees pipelines and tariffs as weapons, not handshakes.
And notice what never shows up in that Sovereignty Act fantasy? No mention of First Nations rights, no mention of environmental protections, no mention of climate reality. It's all cut red tape, ran through permits, and build the pipe, as if Indigenous communities and their courts are just background noise. That's not sovereignty. That's trying to rewind the clock to a country that doesn't exist anymore.
And on top of that, he sneers that Carney hasn't signed one free trade deal. Like Canada is just free to wander the planet signing mega NAFTA clones and nothing else counts. But he leaves out one small detail, Kuzma's China clause. If Canada signs a full-blown free trade agreement with so-called non-market economies like China, well, Trump gets a big red button that lets him blow up the entire North American deal in 6 months.
Carney's not on a free trade deals world tour because the game changed. We already have free trade with more than 50 countries. The EU, Japan, South Korea, the UK, a whole roster of middle powers. The play now is targeted high leverage deals. The China reset that caps their EVs at $49,000 a year at 6.1% tariff while slashing their tariffs on our canola and seafood. The critical minerals partnerships, and an auto strategy that says rebates for Canadian-built EVs and for cars from actual free trade partners, not for cheap models shipped in tariff cap from a non-FTA country.
In other words, we're not out there trying to sign a free trade with everyone like it's a hockey collector card edition. We're trying to sign good deals, deals that put Canada first and protect our workers, and still leaves us with a plan B when Washington decides to have another episode.
And here's the real kicker. While Poilievre is reassuring business crowds that Canada's prosperity is inseparable from a stable U.S. relationship, the guy on the other side of the table is out there saying, we don't need Canadian cars. We don't need Canadian steel. We don't need anything from Canada. And that's Trump's line, not ours. So, Pierre's master plan is to tie our defense spending, our auto sector, and our trade leverage even tighter to a president who keeps telling us he doesn't need what we sell? Come on.
And then there's his Made in Ottawa Sovereignty Act. He throws everything into it. New pipelines, scrapping the carbon tax, fast-tracking housing permits, rewriting IP rules, ramping up defense.
But none of it is costed, and none of it answers the actual question. How does any of this force a White House that's slapping tariffs on us and threatening us about being annexed to suddenly play nice? You'd turn Trump into a reliable partner by quoting Marcus Aurelius and stapling the word sovereignty to an omnibus bill.
And while all this is going on, while Canadians are genuinely afraid of a United States that's slapping tariffs on us, threatening to make us the 51st state, and using our dependence as leverage, what is Poilievre's big emotional outlet for people's anger? It's fake refugees, straight from the mega playbook.
In the same week as this serious statesman's speech on sovereignty, he drops a 2-minute social media hit, stomping down a Toronto sidewalk, promising to cut back deluxe benefits for fake refugees and deport non-citizens and foreign nationals who do crime.
He takes a parliamentary budget officer report about a health program that costs well under 1% of health spending and tries to sell it as the reason that you can't see a doctor. Meanwhile, multiple reports have been crystal clear. The real drivers of wait times are decades of underinvestment, underplanning, failures, and an aging population. It's not a silent claimant.
There's also this weird nostalgia in his speech. I found this really weird. He talks about how Canada and the U.S. built the greatest partnership in history, how we shouldn't confuse the American people with their government, how we mustn't declare a rupture. And again, nobody is arguing with the history. The problem is the present.
When 3/4 of Canadians now see the U.S. unfavorably and the majority see it as our biggest threat, nostalgia isn't a strategy. It's complete denial. And let's be honest, this idea that we must never confuse the American people with their government, well, it sounds nice, but it's not how democracies work. Tens of millions of Americans voted for Trump. Twice. This wasn't some dictatorship ballot where he seized power at gunpoint. No, he was elected, and a huge chunk of the country still approves of what he's doing.
Yes, true. There are also tens of millions of Americans who are furious about all of this, who've marched, organized, and voted against him. Those people are our natural allies, but they're not the ones setting tariffs or threatening annexation right now. We have to deal with the government that actually holds power, not the imaginary America that we wish existed.
So here's the real contrast for Canadians right now. On one side, you've got a prime minister trying to build a new safety net with Asia, Europe, and other middle powers. He's saying out loud that the U.S. is no longer the automatic center of our universe as Canadians, and he's acting accordingly. On the other, you've got an opposition leader who still can't quite bring himself to admit that the neighbor he spent years aligning himself with is now the one Canadians fear most.
One is saying we need plan B, C, and D, and we need them yesterday. The other is saying don't rupture the relationship. Build a pipeline, stockpile some minerals, yell at refugees, and trust that tariffs will magically go away if we're very efficient at issuing permits. So let's end with this question. Are you comfortable with a Canada whose foreign policy is basically pray for a stable America and blame immigrants when things go wrong? Or do you want a Canada that finally believes its own Davos speech, that acts like a country with choices, not a province waiting for instructions?
Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe to tell that algorithm that Trump doesn't run the world or control the internet. Real people's voices need to be heard.
Thanks for watching, everybody. Stay loud, stay informed, and hey, check out our links in the description for other videos, merch, and links to other ways to keep the fight going. We'll see you tomorrow.
Ciao for now.